All right. Hey there, Ruckus Makers. Today I'm joined by Peter, the Ruckus Maker, Stiepleman. And it's so great to have him on the show. He's awesome. And I was on his podcast as well. We'll talk about that. But Peter's a nationally recognized and well-connected educational leader who hosts a new podcast called An Imperfect Leader, which is directed at aspiring and new superintendents. He is the author of a book with the same name, An Imperfect Leader, Human-Centered Leadership in After Action. There it is. Beautiful cover, too. Peter finds inspiration as a team leader with Be the Change Volunteers, where he builds schools and supports the rural communities in the Peruvian Amazon. Peter, welcome to the show.
Danny, thank you so much for having me. I realized that when my parents made that my middle name, that at some point it would come to fruition, that it would be incredibly meaningful.
Yeah, smart parents for sure.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
man, they had the foresight to do it.
Yeah. So, pretty good teacher via relationships, from what I understand. And as a principal, you leverage relationships. And then as a superintendent, there's a constraint, right? It's hard to leverage relationships, and especially in a massive system of 19,000 human beings. So what did you do at that level to make it work?
Yeah, that is so true. I mean, as a principal of an elementary school of about 350 kids, you can have such a deep and personal relationship with children and their families, and then all of a sudden you become the superintendent of 19,000 children, and you cannot use the same. I mean, you have to have relationships and that interpersonal intelligence as a key component of what you do. But it wasn't until I started to really think about systems thinking. Now, I don't want the people who are watching to like tune out, be like, systems thinking, I'm out. No, it's everything from, sort of like when you're making a decision to think about who's not in the room right now, because you make decisions with the people most impacted by that decision, not just in isolation. Or like when you're making a decision to think, what does this look like a year from now, or 3 years from now, or 5 years from now, right? Or how about when you are a principal and you want to agitate for change, you want to be that ruckus maker, and you want to make a decision, and you have to kind of think about, okay, well, I'm going to make this decision, but I don't anticipate seeing the results for a certain amount of time. And there's going to be this tension in between. So making sure that you're attending to that, and how do you sort of prepare for those conversations and those situations. And so it wasn't until I started to really embrace systems and the habits of systems thinking that I became a better leader.
Was there a book, video, podcast, some other kind of resource that really helped develop your systems level thinking?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything from just on the basic level of my own personal sort of growth was, getting things done, right? Just to how to build a better system on how to organize your time. Or Peter Senge's The Fifth Discipline. Or there's an organization called the Water Center for Systems Thinking. And it's really an entire organization almost dedicated just for educators. And so I highly recommend their work. They do such incredible, and they have free modules in terms of how to become just a better systems thinker.
So as a principal, you heard those are your values. They're not our values. Tell us that story.
Oh, man. I was hoping you would ask that, and also dreading that you might ask that. But actually, this is about being vulnerable, right? I mean, a ruckus maker is one who thinks back on their experiences and grows from them. So this happened to be when I was a new superintendent, and I had done all this reading about, you have to bring values, and I was inheriting a system that had 35 different values. It was, values by committee. Anybody who said we should have this value, got included on this list of values, right? Yeah. So I went and visited a Baldrige Award winner. Baldrige is like, this way of sort of businesses get this certification or this recognition of high performance. And so I said to this gentleman, can you tell me a little bit about how you establish values? And he said, you decide the values, you bring them to the institution, to the organization, and then you apply them. And Danny, if I had to say, like, almost like Moses at Mount Sinai, I was like, here are our values. It was
on stone too, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, you know what? Yeah, that's how antiquated my actual pursuit to do this was, sort of
Yeah.
biblical proportion. So I brought them, and nobody said anything. And then as things got difficult, because in any organization there are times of, rough patches, and I
Mm,
turned to a principal. Principals are the most wise individuals who are sandwiched in between central office and families and teachers, and I said, I don't understand, we have these values. And that was the moment that she turned to me and said, no, those are your values, they're not
mm,
our values. And so we had to go through, I mean, first of all, I had to go through my sort of, oh my gosh, but then also a real process to say, okay, then what are our values?
yeah. What did that process look like? So I'm assuming you went back to the drawing board and you did more of a co-created model, but take us through that process.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a great model for anyone as you're trying to tackle anything as an entire organization. So instead of Peter bringing values to his cabinet and then bringing it to the district, this was a much different process. It involves student voice, teacher voice, principal voice, assistant principals, directors, coordinators, custodians, food service, nurses. I mean, anyone and any title that was in the school district, we came together. So I think there were about 200 of us in a room, and we went through this process of, I want you to walk around the room and find someone and share one value that you think
Mm,
should be one of our values. And so they
mhm,
talked to each other, and then they took a moment to write down what they heard the other person say, right? Because it's such an important part of this process is listening. And then they
right.
had to go find someone else in the room and share what they brought to that conversation, as well as what their previous partner had just said. And so now they had four values in their on their paper, and they brought it back to their tables where they had been sitting. And then they, as a table, talked about the values, and then they came up with one value that they were going to share with the whole group. And they had to have a backup because it's very likely that there would be one phrase or one value that would be already have been said, since we had 30
Right.
plus tables. And we kept a list of all of them as people said them. And then we went through this process of not debating, but just sort of speaking up for,
Hmm.
sort of speaking in support of. And so individuals would pop up and say, I really think that collaboration ought to be one of our values, because as an organization, an institution, we need to work together, that solely one of us doing this is not appropriate. And so people got to advocate, and then they sat down, and then we voted. Everyone got three stickers, the sticker sort of way
Yep.
of
Yep.
voting for things. But we did, and you could vote for all of one value, or you could divide up your stickers. And then we revealed a little bit later what our 6 values were going to be. And then a month later, we came back and said, because we needed to have a shared image of what those values meant, right? A shared image
Mhm,
of
mhm,
success. And so we started to define them. And so, and
mm,
then that work, particularly during the pandemic, was so important, because we were really leaning on words like empathy and grace.
mm.
Those were super important to the organization and to those who participated. It was a really great process, and one that can be used in lots of different ways.
For sure. I love the collaboration. That sticker or dot voting. I've used that quite a bit as well. And you've gone from 35 values down to 6, which is a nice tight focus, right? And something that everybody can get behind, commit to memory, and really live out, right? You want to see these things guide the work of the system. So well done. Now
Thanks.
you have an idea about caterpillars and butterflies and how
I
those
do.
two ideas relate to leadership. What's that all about?
That's right. So I'll get closer to the microphone so you can just see the little logo here. But
Yeah.
that is important to me for a couple of reasons. One is, as a leader, you have to know the kind of leader that you are. And for me, the kind of leader and person that I am, I have to resist the level of energy that I sometimes have, that you can probably,
Mhm.
soak in right now, going, whoa, okay, a little much there. But I would say that that can also lead to impulsive decisions. And
Mm,
so the caterpillar, chrysalis, and butterfly sort of metaphor for the life cycle of a butterfly has helped me as a leader sort of make better decisions. And so when I am working with a group or working with a school board, I may say, we're right now in a caterpillar stage, which simply means that we're talking to people and learning from them, and really just moving around the organization and talking to people inside the organization and outside the organization to get a better sense of whether this idea has merit or value within the system. And then Chrysalis says, okay, it seems like we're moving forward. Now let's really dig into what does this look like a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now? What does this look like in terms of human resources? What about finance? What kind of facilities would we might need? And making sure that all those questions, as best to our ability, are answered. And then when you're in a butterfly stage, you're basically ready to launch, and you're starting to talk about communication and how do you make sure that it's really clear on what we're trying to achieve. I would also say for those ruckus makers who are familiar with An Ethic of Excellence, which is a book by Ron Berger, such an amazing book. Everybody should read it. And he tells the story of Austin's butterfly, which is really a student, a child who draws this tiger swallow, and its first iteration is quite crude. I mean, very much like a cartoon. It's got a smiley face, and his peers say, we're supposed to be drawing this tiger swallow, and while that looks like a butterfly, I wonder how you might make it look more like the butterfly we've been studying. And he goes through this process of, second iteration, third iteration, fourth iteration, fifth. And by the time he gets to the sixth, it is just the most beautiful tiger swallow butterfly based on the positive feedback he's gotten from his peers. And so really, it's also a story about how leadership and the work that we do as principals and as educators, that if we were to rest on just that first idea or that first attempt, it won't be as just promising as when we really go through a process and get to that sixth. So that's the butterfly motif for me. For me, I was proposing that we start a bilingual program, and we had all this media in the room, and our teachers union and our principals, and nobody had heard about it except for I sort of said, hey, I think this would be really great, and really had to back up and say there could be and should be a better process for bringing ideas forward.
And what I love about that story too, there's a lot of imagery there. And when I'm teaching core values to schools and systems, I talk about this idea I call sticky core values. So it's more than collaboration or whatever. And basically it's a story and an image, right? Just like you talked about there, going through the caterpillar all the way to the butterfly stage of life. And I love that because stories stick in our minds, and they also really remind us, like, what is this thing that we're trying to do? And it helped you pause, right, for a moment when you were, investigating how to bring that language program to your district and slow things down a little bit. So really great example. And speaking of imagery, you have a story about, I think it's pronounced Daruma dolls. And if I'm saying that
So
wrong,
at the center
correct
of
me.
this logo, and
Yeah.
it's deeply personal. A dear friend of mine, Sam Falbo, who does graphic design, he created this for me. And I asked him, look, I want a butterfly, but would you mind also putting a Daruma doll in the center? And our school district had a sister city, has a sister city in Hakusan, Japan, which is just on the west coast of Japan, in the Ishikawa prefecture, more than 30 years now. And I went to visit our sister city because I wanted to create, and they were very interested in having an exchange where our children could spend parts of their summer at a STEM school in the base of Mount Hakusan, one of the 3 sacred mountains of Japan. And when I was there, I learned a little bit about Daruma dolls. And Daruma dolls are those dolls that you see. They start with 2 vacant eyes, and you fill in one eye when you've set a goal. And then you fill in the second eye when you've completed a goal. So today is the official launch of my book, which I'm so grateful to you and the Ruckus Makers to be a part of that, which is probably fueling some of this energy I'm having. And so today I will complete the second eye on my Daruma doll because I set this goal of writing a book and having it published and having it launch. And so, but also I left one eye colored in and one eye vacant because to some extent, as Ruckus Makers know, in public education, you get your fair share of black eyes. So, it's really about goal setting, but also a reminder, this job is tough. And it has never been harder to be a teacher or to be a principal than it is today. And so for
Yeah.
those who are out there who get support from people like you, Danny, leaders like you who are regularly convening, whether virtually or in person, not losing sight of that community is super important. So the dermatologist also
Yeah.
is just kind of grounds me and reminds me that we set goals. Sometimes they take a while to get there, but not to lose sight of them.
That's so good. And yeah, again, an image, a story, the two eyes, and how you work with those. I really appreciate that. And thanks for the little nudge, right? For the ruckus maker listening or watching, we do offer support to school leaders. And so I will never promise that the job will be easy, but it's certainly easier when you have a board of directors, you have weekly support from top coaches and mentors, and you get to dig into that work, right? And navigate it deeply on a weekly basis. So if people want to check that out, go to betterleadersbetterschools.com/mastermind to learn more. So today the book's out, right? An Imperfect Leader is there. We
That's
saw
right.
the cover. Feel free to
That's right.
show it
I'll
again.
show it to you
It's
again. And it's sort of, the image, which I appreciated you pointing out, is all
systems.
about systems, right?
Yeah,
Right. The
yeah,
different,
totally comes through.
dials that we turn and leverage points we seek, and the constant, conversations we have, and keeping set on goal, and knowing that it's not a linear path, and knowing
Mm,
that sometimes it takes time, and sometimes it takes years to get to where you're
sure.
going. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
yeah, it's deeply personal. It's speaks to the experiences of a superintendent over a 7-year period, but it
Mm,
also launches and releases a leadership model that draws on so many people like
right.
Carol Dweck in terms of mindsets, Peter Senge in terms of systems, certainly Ron Berger in an ethic of excellence, and just takes some of the just those really human-centered leaders and puts it into a framework that I think just for me makes sense. And when you ask me, so 19,000 kids, what really helped you sort of, well, it was systems, definitely, but this
Hmm.
leadership model of a human-centered model for school transformation became my anchor, sort of became my, oh, that's how you lead.
Absolutely. And I think it's probably a good spot to take a quick break for our message from our sponsors. But when we get back, let's talk about that model. I think having a human-centered, framework for school transformation is really important, and ruckus makers would love to hear more about that.
Sounds good.
So learn how to successfully navigate change, shape your school's success, and empower your teams with Harvard's certificate in school management and leadership. Get online professional development that fits your schedule. Courses include leading change, leading school strategy and innovation, leading people, and leading learning. You can apply today at betterleadersbetterschools.com/Harvard. You know what student engagement sounds like. Students ask questions, build on each other's ideas. The classroom's alive with conversation. Creating that kind of classroom is much easier said than done, and TeachFX helps teachers make it happen. Their AI provides teachers with insights into high leverage teaching practices like how much student talk happened, which questions got students talking. TeachFX is like giving each teacher their own on demand instructional coach to help them boost student engagement and learning as well as their own. It's eye opening for teachers and scales the impact of each coach and principal. Ruckus makers can start a free pilot with your teachers today. Go to teachfx.com/BLBS to launch a free pilot at your school. And finally, as students progress through their K 12 experience, schoolwork gets harder and more complex. Yet at the same time, students are asked to be more independent in their learning. Young people struggling with executive functioning skills will fall further and further behind. And the reality is, the pandemic only made it worse. The remedy is found in equipping students with executive functioning skills. And our friends over at Organized Binder have released a new self paced course that will teach you how to teach these executive functioning skills and set your students up for success. Learn more at organizedbinder.com/go and set your students up for success. All right, we're back with Peter, the ruckus maker, Stiepleman. And today his book came out, An Imperfect Leader, Human-Centered Leadership in After Action. And prior to the break, we talked about how having this human-centered framework, right, as a foundation of everything you do can lead to great results. So can you unpack that framework a little bit for us, Peter?
Sure. So the way that the framework works, and Potentially, I can share maybe when we're when this gets posted or something like that, just what the framework looks like.
Sure.
But at the center is deeper leading and deeper learning. We all are trying to get to this place where we're constantly working to get better, right? And I think that's probably a big reason why you and I connected so meaningfully. You were so wonderful to be on my podcast, An Imperfect Leader, because of that human-centered piece that you bring to the work. So, human-centered is all about the people. And so there are
Mm,
three domains when you think about this model. The first is collective aspiration, which simply is just the heart of anything that we do. It really speaks to, what do we want to create together and how do we want to be together? The
hmm
second is nested patterns. So we talked a little bit about values, and that could kind of fit into what are nested patterns. It's just as an organization, how do we work? So, do we demonstrate empathy and compassion? Do we show a growth mindset? Those types of things. And then lastly, it's the leader's learning work is the last domain. And it really is the mind of the work. So, systems are in
mm,
there. But also, what I think is probably the most important of the leader's learning work is serving as a lead learner. So ruckus makers who are principals or are teachers, they know how important it is for teachers and leaders to be working together. And so you don't, you just read to us and reminded us about all these different organizations that are sponsoring your program and who really are about getting better. And could
mm.
you imagine a principal who just sends people to trainings as opposed to learns alongside their teachers? That's serving as a
Got it.
lead learner. But
hmm
lastly, a lead learner is someone who admits when they make a mistake. And how many of us have worked for people who seem so reluctant to be
Yeah.
vulnerable? And so that's what a lead learner is. And it's someone who's willing to be vulnerable, and is willing to say, I made a mistake, and then to take that mid-course correction to rectify whatever it is that they've where they've erred. So that's
Mm.
the model in a short frame, but you can
Sure.
certainly learn more about it. My website is www.peterstiepleman, no ruckus maker in there.com. I took out the middle
It,
name, otherwise it's way too long. Way too long.
it's just implied, right?
Yeah,
But
it's
keep it.
implied. That's right.
You
It's
know,
a silent ruckus
it's a
maker.
silent ruckus maker. I, uh, I love the name of what we do, right? Better leaders, better schools. I think how we serve is in the name. But then after typing it right via email and website for the last 8 years almost, I'm just like, wow, that's a long one. So I figured
You
out a
cramp
way
up in
to
the
make it.
middle. You go, I can't
Yeah,
do it.
yeah. I've got little 4-letter codes now that I could use
Okay,
to
good.
expand it. But anyways, hindsight's always 2020. So I love the idea of the framework. I'm just curious too within the book. I don't know if there's stories, case studies, or is there like a way that you push the reader on how to implement the framework?
Yes. Oh, I'm so glad you asked. The book is a collection of stories. In fact, there's a whole
Right.
section on the power of storytelling and its
Mm,
importance in this work. And so each chapter looks at one big issue that the superintendent faced in that year, and then forces the superintendent to break that down into, so what happened and what got overlooked
right.
and what did they learn about relationships and what frustrated them and what could they have done differently. So different from what got overlooked sometimes is your own
Yeah.
personal role in that experience.
Sure.
And then in the end, what was something that was good that came out of the experience? Because through one's experiences and mistakes, that's where our greatest learning happens. And so and at the end of every chapter actually has some questions from the Water Center. They were so generous to give
Mm,
me permission to use some of their habits of thinking, systems thinking tools to prompt the reader to think about their own experiences. And I mean, it's everything from bringing values to sharing goals to there's a chapter on LGBTQ plus posters that a Gay Straight Alliance club put around the school, and in a community that was very split, progressive and conservative, the superintendent trying to navigate and find common ground, and how that was a real learned experience. So I won't tell you exactly what happened because I think you should read the book.
read the book. Yeah. No, that's great. It sounds very practical. And one of my sort of values or things that I teach, I say ideas are great, but not the greatest. And the
Yeah.
only thing better than idea is actually taking action. So it sounds like you really push the reader and the ruckus maker to do that. And I am excited for what got launched today. So highly
I'm
recommend
so grateful.
that
Yeah.
everybody grab Peter's book, An Imperfect Leader, Human-Centered Leadership and After Action. Uh, so I think where I want to end is, you mentioned that you had a kind of famous aunt, right? And
I wasn't sure
who
if you're
who
going to
was
bring it
she?
up.
I wanted to, just because you don't hear this every day, right? So who was your aunt, and what was a lesson that she taught you?
So my aunt was Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and man, when you ask what did she teach, I mean, look, you're talking about an individual who was on the
Yeah.
law review at Columbia and Harvard and graduated first in her class, and not only battled sexism personally, but also just fought for gender equality. And so
Mm,
we are all a product of how we've been socialized. So you can expect that the sort of cultural field that existed in my family was about that exactly in terms of gender equity and working towards a more just community and a more just country. I would tell you though, she sent me she would send me speeches that she had read or had written, and there's a quote in one that I use all the time as I think about change, because our systems, they will work aggressively to return to status quo. And that's why I just love this whole idea of the ruckus maker, because it is about
mhm.
agitating for change, to mess with the status quo, to say we can do better. And so she sent me a quote that was exactly this: that real change, enduring change, happens step at a time. And so it's really important to think about that as a ruckus maker, that while we want to agitate for change, these systems that we're trying to change have been in effect for hundreds of years. And so
Mhm.
really it's about making that incremental change, as much as that makes us impatient, and sometimes seems as if it's not what we typically want to pursue. We want to see real change real fast, but enduring change is step at a time. So I would say that's probably one of my greatest learnings from her.
So important and appropriate for a ruckus maker too, because in the system of education, sometimes there's the pressure, often there's the pressure to make the change happen immediately. But it's
Yeah, you're
totally,
hired by a school board, or you're
yeah,
hired by a superintendent who says, "I want you to go in that school and I want you to make change." And really what they're doing is setting you up for failure,
big
because
time.
real
We
change
know
is step by step. Yeah,
step by step, and the research shows that it takes years, right? I think like
that's
5 to
right.
7, I want to say, for high schools, and like 3 to 5 for elementary.
You're so
In
right. Yeah. How do you
you
build
need to
trust
give
immediately? You walk in, you say, "Trust me," right? Like, "Oh, okay. Glad you're here.
yeah,
Now we're gonna
and you're
trust."
gonna love these changes and the results
You're
we're
gonna
gonna
love
get.
them. And
So
I'm the fifth
yeah,
teacher you've had in 4 years, or fifth principal
a
you've
fifth
had in 4
principal.
years. But you can
Yeah,
expect that. But
it's gonna
I've
work
got
this
it.
time.
It's gonna work
It's
this
gonna
time.
work. Yeah, yeah. So I really appreciate that, because and often too, Dan Sullivan, he runs a program called Strategic Coach that I just joined. And he has a book and a concept called The Gap and the Gain, and I can so relate to this. I bet you can too. But so you set the goal, and then you haven't achieved the goal, even though you set it 5 seconds ago, maybe 5 days ago, 5 weeks even. And then all of a sudden you're frustrated because there's that gap that exists between where your current reality is and where you want to be. And he always says the solution is to look backward, to look at the progress you've achieved. So I think,
That's
at
so
least for
true.
me, I have a couple more questions for you to end the podcast, but I want the ruckus maker uh, to remember that it is that incremental step by step change. And when you're frustrated that you're not there yet, you're looking the wrong way, look backward and just see all the great progress that you've made. So,
Yeah, and
Peter, now,
document, whether it's photos or
ah,
or just
yeah,
being
yeah,
in schools, because looking at that photo evidence of the progress you've made, it really is, it's empowering.
100%. So here at the end of the show, I like to ask the guests, the same questions, and we're at that point now. So if you could put a message on all school marquees around the world for a single day, what would your message be?
So I've listened and enjoyed so many of your guests, and often it is about the message for children. I'm going to sort of say the message for your teachers and your community, which is by Rutger Bregman, who wrote Humankind, and his quote is, "New ideas start on the fringes, and then they move towards the center. And just an example would be like esports, how we thought that was such a foreign idea, and now it has moved towards the center as an accepted way of engaging and including children in our communities.
Where were the scholarships when I was playing Nintendo? That's
Right?
what I want to know. Yeah, totally.
Well, anyone should go reach out to Tony Grignani out in St. Louis area, man. He's doing amazing stuff in the Midwest for esports.
Very cool. We'll check that out. And Peter, if you were building your dream school, right, you weren't constrained by any sort of resources. Your only limitation was your ability to imagine. So, what would be the 3 guiding principles building this dream school?
I'll call them the 3 C's. Curiosity, that good things happen when we lead with questions like what if? Compassion, that leaps of faith happen when we're with others. And then the last is collaboration. We thrive when we abandon isolation and we come together and do it together. The 3 C's,
Yes.
that would be the guiding principles.
So, we've covered a lot of ground today, Peter. Of everything we discussed, what's the one thing you want a ruckus maker to remember?
So this is my final, I get the last word?
You get the last word.
Awesome. I'd say this, that every decision has consequences, and many of them are unintended. So be a ruckus maker, disrupt the status quo. And while you're doing that, be prepared for the system to work aggressively to return to stasis. So plan for those unintended consequences and try to bring together as many ruckus makers in your community as possible. Some of whom have been like 13-year cicadas or like the agave americana, that cactus that only blooms 1 in 100 years, because they have been lying dormant, waiting for you to wake them up.